Okay, we have been dis-
Now,
Now,
we've been
we've
talking
been
about the
talking about
loss
the
of
loss
animal
of animal
habitat from
habitat from
housing
housing
developments,
developments,
growing
growing
cities,
cities,
small
small
habitat
habitat
losses.
losses.
But
But
today I
today,
want to
I
begin
will be
talking about what
talking
happens
about
when
what
habitat
happens
is
when habitat
reduced
is
across a
reduced across a
large
large
area.
area.
There are, of
There
course,
are, of
animal
course,
species
animal
that
species that
require large
require large
areas of
area of
habitat,
habitat,
and
and
some migrate
some
over
might run
very
over
long
very long
distances.
distances.
So, what's the
So
impact of
what's the
habitat
impact of
loss
habitat
on
loss
those
on
animals,
those
animals that
animals that
need
need
large areas of
large areas
habitat?
of habitat?
Well, I'll
Well,
use the
I will
hummingbirds
use
as
the
an example.
hummingbird as an
Now,
example.
you know
Now,
a
you know a
hummingbird is
hummingbird is
amazingly
amazingly
small,
small,
but even
but
though it's
even though
really
it's very
tiny, it
tiny, it
migrates over
migrates
very long
over very long
distances,
distances,
travels up and down the
towards
Western
the
Hemisphere, the
hemisphere,
Americas,
the America,
back and forth
back
between
and
where it
forth
breeds in
between
the summer
where it
and the
breeds in the
warmer
summer
climates
and the
where it
warmer
spends the
climates
winter.
where it is winter.
So, we would say that this whole area over which it migrates is its habitat.
Hmm? Ah.
Because on this long
Because
distance journey, it needs to come
needs
down
to come
to
down
feed
to
and
feed
sleep
and
every
sleep
so often,
every
right?
so often, right?
Well,
Well,
the
the
hummingbird beats its
hummingbird
wings,
beats its
get
wings,
this,
get this,
about
about
3,000
3,000
times per minute.
times per
So
minute.
you think,
So you think,
wow,
wow,
it must
it
need a
must
lot of
need a
energy,
lot
a
of
lot of
energy,
food,
a lot of
right?
food, right?
Well, it does.
It
It
does.
drinks a
It runs
lot
a
of
lot
nectar
of
from
nectar from
flowers and
flowers
feeds
and
on some
feed on
insects,
some
but
insects,
it's
but it's
energy
energy
efficient
efficient
too.
too.
You can't say it
You
isn't.
can
I
say
mean,
that it
as it
is.
flies
I
all
mean,
the
as
way
it's a
across the
flight
Gulf of
all the
Mexico, it
way
uses up
from some
almost
member of
none
it
of its
uses
body fat.
now of this body fat.
But that doesn't mean it
But
doesn't
that
need to
doesn't
eat.
mean it doesn't need meat.
So hummingbirds have to
So
rely on
rely
plants
on
in their
plants in
natural
their
habitat.
natural
And
habitat,
it
and
goes
it
without
goes
saying,
without
but
saying. But
well,
well,
the
the
opposite is true as
opposite
well.
is true as
Plants
well.
depend on
Plants
hummingbirds
depend on
too.
hummingbirds too.
There are some
There
flowers
are
that
some
can
flowers
only
that
be
can only
pollinated by
be
the hummingbird
pollinated
without it stopping to
that
feed
will
and spreading
feed.
pollen from flower to flower. These plants
And
would
the
cease to
flowers
exist.
exist.
But the problem,
That's the
well,
problem. Well,
as natural
as natural
habitat along
habitat
these
allows
migration
this
routes is
migration
developed by
is
humans
by
for
human for
housing or
housing or
agriculture or
agriculture,
cleared for
clear
raising
for
cattle,
raising
for
cattle,
instance,
for instance.
there's less
There
food
is a
available
rest
for
for
migrating hummingbirds.
migrant
Their
hummingbirds.
nesting sites
Their
are affected
nesting sites
too,
are
the
affected
same by
too,
the
the
same
same by
sorts
the
of
same
human
source of human
activities.
activities.
And all of
And
these
all
activities
these
pose a real
activities
threat
pose a real
to the
threat to
hummingbird
the
population.
human
So,
population.
to help
So,
them
to
survive,
help them
we
survive,
need to
we need to
preserve their
preserve their
habitats.
habitats.
And one of the
And one of
concrete
the
ways people
concrete
have been
ways
doing
people
this
have
is
been
by
doing
cleaning
this is
up
cleaning up
polluted
polluted
habitat areas
habitat area
and then
and then
replanting
they
flowers,
planted a flower
replanting native
replanting
flowers
native
that
flowers
hummingbirds
that
feed on.
hummingbirds feed on.
Promoting
Promoting
ecological tourism is
ecological
another way
tourism
to
is
help save
another
their
way to
habitat,
help save their
as the
habitat
number of
as the number
visitors,
of visitors,
ecotourists, who come
ecotourism
to
who come to
hummingbird habitats to
hummingbird
watch the
habitat to
birds.
watch the birds.
The more
The
the
more
number of
number
visitors
of the
grows,
visitors
the more
grows, the
local
more
businesses profit.
profit.
So
So
ecological tourism
ecological
can bring
tourism can
financial
bring
rewards.
financial rewards.
All the more reason to
Also, more
value
reason
these beautiful little
to these
creatures in their
beautiful little
habitat, right?
creatures in their habitat, right?
But to
But to
understand more
understand
about
more
how to
about
protect
how
and
to
support
protect them to
hummingbirds the
support the
best we can,
home
we've got to learn more about their breeding, nesting sites, and migration routes, and also
migration
about
route
the
and
natural habitats we find
also
there.
how we hide there.
That should help us
So
determine
just
how
how
to
to
prevent
determine how
further
to
decline in
prevent
the
further
population.
decline of the population.
A good
And
research
root
method, a good
research
way
methods
to
are a
learn
good way
more,
to
is
learn
by
more is by
running a
running
banding
a
study.
bounding study.
Banding of birds
Banding
allows us to track them
allows
over
us
their
to track
lifetime. It's
their
a practice
lifetime.
that's been
It's
used by
been
researchers
practiced
for
as
years.
used by
In fact,
researchers
most
for
of what we
years
know
and
about hummingbirds comes from banding
coming
studies,
from
where
banding
we
study where
capture a
we
hummingbird
capture
and make
hummingbird
sure all the
make sure
information
all
about
the
it,
information
like
about it,
its
like
weight
its
and
weight and
age and
age and
length, are all
range,
recorded and put
all
into
recorded and to
an
an
international
international
information
information
database.
database.
And then
And
we
then
place
we
an
place
extremely
an
lightweight
extreme
band around
lightweight
one of
band
its
on
legs.
one
Well,
of its
what
legs.
looks
So
like a leg, although
always looks
technically
like
it's
all
considered part of the
technically
bird's
it's
foot.
considered part of their foot.
Anyway, these bands are
Anyways, these
perfectly
bands
safe,
are
and
perfectly
some
safe and
hummingbirds have
some
worn them for
hummingbirds
years with
will
no
wear
evidence
for
of any
years.
problems. The band is labeled with
And
a
will
tracking
be
number.
tracking number.
Oh, and there's a phone number on the
There's a
band
phone
for
number
people to
on the
call
phone
for free
for
to
free to
report a
report a
banded bird they've
bird
found
and
or
found
recaptured.
recaptured.
So, when a
So
banded
when a
bird is
banded bird
recaptured
is
and
captured and
reported, we
reported,
learn
we
about its
learn about its
migration route,
migration route,
its
its
growth
growth,
and and how long
and
it's been
how long
alive.
it's been
Its
alive.
lifespan.
Its lifespan.
One recaptured bird had been banded almost 12 years earlier. She's one of the oldest hummingbirds on record. Another interesting thing we've learned is that some hummingbirds, they no longer use a certain route. They travel by a different route to reach their destination. And findings like these have been of interest to biologists and environmental scientists in a number of countries who are trying to understand the complexities of how changes in a habitat affect the species in it.
Discussing film in the 1920s. Okay, we have been discussing film in the 1920s and 30s, and how back then film categories, as we know them today, had not yet been established. We said that by today's standards, many of the films of the 20s and 30s would be considered hybrids. That is, a mixture of styles that wouldn't exactly fit into any of today's categories. And in that context, today we're going to talk about a filmmaker who began making very unique films in the late 1920s. He was French, and his name was Jean Painlevé. Jean Painlevé was born in 1902. He made his first film in 1928. Now, in a way, Painlevé's films conform to norms of the 20s and 30s. That is, they don't fit very neatly into the categories we use to classify films today. That said, even by the standards of the 20s and 30s, Painlevé's films were a unique hybrid of styles. He had a special way of fusing, or some people might say confusing, science and fiction. His films begin with facts, but then they become more and more fictional. They gradually add more and more fictional elements. In fact, Painlevé was known for saying that science is fiction. Painlevé was a pioneer in underwater filmmaking, and a lot of his short films focus on the aquatic animal world. He liked to show small underwater creatures displaying what seemed like familiar human characteristics, what we think of as unique to humans. He might take a clip of a mollusk going up and down in the water and set it to music, to make it look as if the mollusk were dancing to the music, like a human being, that sort of thing. But then he'd suddenly change the image or narration to remind us how different the animals are, how unlike humans. He confused his audience in the way he portrayed the animals he filmed, mixing up our notions of the categories human and animal. The films make us a little uncomfortable at times because we're uncertain about what we're seeing. It gives his films an uncanny feature. The familiar made unfamiliar, the normal made suspicious. He liked twists. He liked the unusual. In fact, one of his favorite sea animals was the seahorse, because with seahorses, it's the male that carries the eggs, and he thought that was great. His first and most celebrated underwater film is about the seahorse. Susan, you have a question?
But underwater filmmaking wasn't that unusual, was it? I mean, weren't there other people making movies underwater?
Well, actually, it was pretty rare at that time. I mean, we're talking the early 1930s here.
But what about Jacques Cousteau? Wasn't he like an innovator, with underwater photography too?
Ah, Jacques Cousteau. Well, Painlevé and Cousteau did both film underwater, and they were both innovators, so you're right in that sense. But that's pretty much where the similarities end. First of all, Painlevé was about 20 years ahead of Cousteau, and Cousteau's adventures were high-tech with lots of fancy equipment, whereas Painlevé kind of patched equipment together as he needed it. Cousteau usually filmed large animals, usually in the open sea, whereas Painlevé generally filmed smaller animals, and he liked to film in shallow water. What else? Well, the main difference was that Cousteau simply investigated and presented the facts. He didn't mix in fiction. He was a strict documentarist. He set the standard, really, for the nature documentary. Painlevé, on the other hand, as we said before, mixed in elements of fiction, and his films are much more artistic, incorporating music as an important element. John, you have a question?
Well, maybe I shouldn't be asking this, but if Painlevé's films are so special, so good, why haven't we ever heard of them? I mean, everyone's heard of Jacques Cousteau.
Well, that's a fair question. Um, the short answer is that Painlevé's style just never caught on with the general public. I mean, it probably goes back, at least in part, to what we mentioned earlier, that the people didn't know what to make of his films, that they were confused by them. Whereas Cousteau's documentaries were very straightforward, met people's expectations more than Painlevé's films did. But your true film history buffs know about him, and Painlevé's still highly respected in many circles.
Hi, Professor Archer.
Okay,